Just thanks to whoever started the recording. Carin is the director of homelessness and housing for the Government Performance Lab's National Housing Network. And before that, she was Assistant Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Supportive and Affordable Housing. Kate joins us as the Assistant Director for their children and families team. And she really leads a team focused on designing and testing approaches to strengthening social service delivery and improving outcomes for children and family through engagements with state and local government. So Kate also has 2 cats, so feel free to press 1 if you're a cat person, 2 if you're more of a dog person, and we will go ahead and get started. So Carin, I will hand it over to you, and thank you so much for leading this fantastic session. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you all for having us. We're really excited to be with you here today. Kate Lawyer, do you mind just advancing the slides? I think we can go straight to the objectives. Great, awesome, thank you. Okay, thank you guys all for having us today. We're really excited to get a chance to highlight some of our work and hopefully impart some of our learnings in terms of running effective pilots. To get started, let's talk about what we hope you all get out of today. We're going to share examples of pilots that we've run with state and local governments, highlighting specific tactics that can be used in 3 main phases of projects. First, we're going to talk about how to get started by sharing examples of work we've done where the problem we were trying to answer was really clearly defined and informed the overall structure of the project to give ongoing guidance in shaping the work. Specifically, we'll cover examples of how to define the problem, how to incorporate stakeholders, and how to pick a starting place. Then we're going to talk about the role of continuous improvement while running a pilot, specifically talking about the importance of setting up monitoring tools that help keep you aligned with your original intentions and allows for ongoing adjustment. Here, we'll talk about how to collect the right data to inform you in real time if your investment is having the impact intended, rather than looking backwards when it would be too late to make any adjustments. Lastly, we're going to talk about how to set up your project for long-term sustainability by discussing approaches to scaling and spreading. All right, next slide. Okay, so here's how we're going to approach giving you some tools for the starting, running, and expansion of pilots. We're going to spend some time telling you a bit about ourselves and about what we do at the Government Performance Lab. We'll talk briefly about why piloting can be hard or feel risky, but why it still matters. Then most of our time today will be really highlighting the tactics that we think to be essential and establishing effective pilots and are used throughout the life of a pilot, from getting started through continuous improvement and landing on how to scale and spread. Okay, we'll break down these tactics by talking through 3 case studies of successful pilots that we've run. To break down tactics of getting started, we'll take you through a project we ran in Denver, Colorado to create permanent supportive housing for multi-system users. Then, to focus on continuous improvement, we'll take you through a project we did recently out of Chicago, Illinois, to distribute emergency rental assistance within the context of racial equity goals. Lastly, as an example of how to set up pilots from onset with a real eye towards scaling and spreading, we'll take you through a project out of Washington State that's centered on early learn referrals from the child welfare system. We'll leave you with some resources so you can learn more about any of the projects we discuss or about our work more broadly. And then lastly, at the end, as Kate said, we're going to have an open forum Q&A to use the time as everyone sees fit. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and many of the slides we've prepared are really dense, so we'll be sure to share the presentation afterwards. No need to feel like you need to be capturing or sort of taking notes as we go along. Before we dive in, let us just tell you a bit about ourselves. I can go first. I'm Carin Clary, and as Kate said, I'm the Director for Homelessness and Housing at the Government Performance Lab based at Harvard's Kennedy School. Prior to joining the GPL, I served for nearly 20 years as a tried and true practitioner in New York City. I've spent about half of my career working on the front lines of social service delivery in not-for-profit organizations, and the other half working in city government. My time working in government has been pretty evenly split, working in a mayor's office on that level in terms of coordinating citywide efforts, but I've also worked within discrete city agencies directly managing operations. In terms of policy areas, the first half of my career was really spent in criminal justice reform, specifically through economic mobility programs. And for the past decade, I've worked exclusively on large city homeless response and rehousing strategy in New York City. I feel like the split that I've had in my career of both being in the mayor's office, but also having been in the trenches of agencies or nonprofits, that's really colored my perspective on the topic of pilots, as I've both been in the position of being like the pusher onto agencies or contractors telling them that they must do a pilot, or I've been on the receiving end of the gift of a mandatory pilot that my agency was going to participate in. And I can assure you that my feelings on pilots have varied greatly, depending if I was the pusher or the receiver. Presently, I lead GPL's national homelessness and housing work as we stand up our new practice on homelessness prevention and rehousing strategy. If time allows, at the very end, I can tell you about some exciting opportunities we have on the horizon. On a more personal level, I grew up out west in very rural, small town Colorado, and I now live outside of New York City with my spouse and our 2 daughters. And lastly, I just want to say that I'm really a firm believer that the people that are working closest to the problem are the people that are most likely to unlock the solutions. So I'm especially honored to be with you all today. Kate Lawyer, I'll pass it to you.
Great, thanks, Carin. Yeah, I just want to start by saying, echoing what Carin ended there on, which is thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to this. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk about this topic. It's a topic that I care a lot about, and I'm really excited to get some time today to think about it. So the other Kate already gave you a little bit of background about me, but I'll just add to that by saying that my work at the GPL, I've been here about 3 years now, has really focused on making it easier for families. For example, those who are entangled in the criminal justice system or struggling with parental substance use, making it easier to connect those families to prevention services. And by that, I really mean services outside of the child welfare system, which in many jurisdictions tends to be sort of the leading children and family serving agency in state government. So this work has included strengthening referral pathways, helping to improve social service procurement processes, and helping governments implement data-driven management practices. And at the GPL, I've both been sort of leading on projects or managing projects, and then when I started directly implementing some, supporting the implementation of some of these projects as well in Washington State. And across all of these, I think the goal of the work has always been to ensure that families can access supports that are more responsive to the needs that they have. So whether that's substance use treatment programs or things that are more like cash assistance and family well-being programs. So interested in definitely that whole portfolio of supports. Before the GPL, I had not a totally different career, but a pretty different career. I worked in international development for about 10 years. So I was a program officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. Also focused on government capacity building and policy implementation, but in a very different geographic context. And I'll just say that a lot of the challenges and quirks of government transcend international boundaries, including government's love of acronyms. So I think it was Allison who made a joke about that earlier. Lots of acronyms, always lots of acronyms. Before the Gates Foundation, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I lived in West Africa for 3 years, in Niger and in Senegal. So definitely had a really rich experience in an aid recipient country. And then like Carin, I grew up out west in a small town in rural Montana, so slightly different location. And I now live on the West Coast with my spouse and, as you all know, my 2 cats. So I'm definitely a cat person.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so let's maybe go forward. Kate, do you want to skip ahead? Cool, thank you. So let me share a bit about the Government Performance Lab to give you some context of who we are as an organization. So what is the Government Performance Lab? The GPL is an applied research and technical assistance organization based at the Harvard Kennedy School. The key issue we are trying to tackle is that vulnerable people, particularly in communities of color, are disproportionately ensnared in punitive and harmful interventions. They are poorly served by systems that are supposed to support them, and they're often shut out entirely from the systems that build economic mobility and power. We know governments and communities are trying to build towards new systems that shift from punishment to prevention, that provide supports that actually work, and create equitable access to resources. Our mission and theory of change is we support governments in building just and effective service systems that deliver better outcomes for the people they serve. The primary way that we do our work is by working closely with state and local governments that are developing and testing transformative initiatives, supporting them in designing, managing, and sustaining those efforts. Through the support, we believe we are helping governments come to the table more capable and more ready to act, and we help unlock the investments of communities, advocates, and providers that are working to bring about systems change. Next slide. Great. So we'll talk about our model and our impact at the JPL. We find that when governments are taking on major reform efforts, there's often a huge rush of resources and attention to help design and plan for changes, but that external support and resources often fall off when it comes to actually implementing these ideas. So starting with our sort of deep red box here on this slide, our primary model is we hire and train full-time staff who work shoulder to shoulder with government agencies to move these projects forward. This model centers on intensive engagements with state and local governments, often for a minimum of 12 months, but often running for 36 months, where our staff is typically embedded within or working closely with a government agency. Since our founding in 2011, we've now done over 200 projects all over the country. Then moving into the sort of slightly darker pink box, we're also providing technical expertise and solutions learned from working with many other governments around the country, as the projects that we do nationally aim to identify and demonstrate solutions. We then work to spread these solutions to influence service design and delivery nationwide. We do this by publishing technical guides and case studies, as well as holding learning calls. And then just lastly, shifting out to sort of the light pink box that's here, we think about systems change through the impacts that we've had on the workforce, as we've trained nearly 2,000 government leaders in our techniques, and we're also working to invest in the skills of the future public sector leaders. The GPL staff all get intensive training when they join our organization, and the fellows that we are placing within governments to run these projects get high-touch coaching by the experienced GPL managers during the course of their project. Next slide. Great. So we currently work in 5 policy areas: homelessness and housing, children and families, criminal justice, economic mobility, and procurement systems. Across all of our work, we've developed expertise in a set of what we call strategic capabilities that we bring to all of our projects that are the essential tools we use to create change in government operations and ultimately improve services for clients. Okay, I think that covers our background and hopefully gives you some context of how we are using discrete test projects towards our larger goals of systems change. I'm going to pass it over to Kate Lawyer to take us into talking specifically about pilots.
Great, yes. Really excited again about this topic. Before we get into the substance of the presentation, I think we want to pull back and just think a little bit about why do pilots matter? Why is this a topic that that we should be covering today? And as sort of an entry point into that to get us started, I'd love to do a quick pulse check of the audience and just sort of understand where you all are with this topic. So in the chat, I would love to hear what your experience is with pilot programs. One is you're really just starting out, you've heard the word pilot before, but you're really not sure what it's all about. Number 2 is maybe you've heard more about it, but you yourself have not run one. You've maybe been sort of a passenger in a pilot. And then number 3 is if you've run a pilot and currently or in the past and have more experience with that. So I'm seeing lots of 2s. And then for those of you who do have experience running a pilot, I would love a sentence or 2 about to describe what you've done. Okay, looks like we mostly have 2s and 3s, a couple 1s. That's great. So yeah, great. Seems like pretty common for folks to have at least some experience around pilots, including Jack is telling us he helped test automated shuttle vehicles for suitability of community services. I love that as a pilot. Okay, great. So keep dropping those comments in the chat and moving us ahead here. I think when Carin and I were thinking about, why do pilots matter? Why why does it matter for government? What we really came to is thinking about why does government matter overall in terms of trying to move the needle on important social issues. And as I'm sure many of you are already aware, government is often bringing resources and systems to the table that can have a really huge impact on solving some of the most pressing challenges that we're facing as a society. And often government is bringing the largest pot of resources to be able to move the needle on those things. So I mentioned I have a background in philanthropy, working for one of the most well-endowed philanthropies in the world. And still we knew when we were making grants that no amount of money we could give would really, it always paled in comparison to what the resources governments were putting on the table. So it represents a huge potential. And at the same time, government doesn't have has a sort of a reputation of being a bit stale, a little stagnant, of not being able to get things done. One of the reasons for that, we think, is that often there aren't very many incentives for governments to take risks or try new things. And part of that is that the failures that government experience get way more attention than the successes. And that can just create a really huge downside risk for governments in wanting to try new things and sort of make it much less enticing, much less appealing for them to try new things. So it's hard, but it's so important to take the step to try and improve performance and unlock the potential of the public sector, because we really believe and have seen through our work at the GPL that it's through experimentation, through taking risks and trying new things, expecting that not everything is going to work. That's how you learn and that's how you improve. So we think that that's a really important, an important thing to keep in mind when contemplating pilots. Back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so here's the real substance of what we want to talk you through today. From our work at the GPL, we've identified what we think are 7 tactics to design pilots with effective measurement practices and long-term scaling potential. Oh, I feel like I'm getting feedback.
Yeah, can we maybe just ask everyone to make sure they're muted?
Okay. All right, that sounds better. So again, we're going to move through each of these tactics through actual project examples that we think demonstrate them in practice, and also flow along the different phases of setting up pilots that we outlined in our objectives. Let's walk through each of the tactics now that will be referenced in the cases we discussed. So starting from the left, the first is set a North Star. By this, we mean develop a clearly defined problem you are trying to address that helps you begin to scope out the work of the project and to act as a continued guide to set your path forward, as well as measure your success again. Second, map your dependencies. By this, we mean knowing what is going to make or break the success of getting your pilot off the ground, especially in terms of stakeholder buy-in, to establish the necessary rapport to launch your project work and to develop the credibility to implement the solutions you are proposing. Third, engage those closest to the problem, both for purposes of establishing relationships, but also for valuable intel and data that's going to shape your work. Fourth, start somewhere. Don't wait for perfect conditions or a project scope that addresses all things to be in place before you begin. Recognize the goal of your pilot will be to start somewhere, and then, moving on to number 5, set up systems to use high-frequency metrics to improve your project. This means establish early on the data you are going to need to collect that will give you real-time insight into how your project is operating. This will allow you to, moving on to 6, adapt your approach as you learn. This means that your plan may, and often it really should, change as you are running your project. Be iterative. The goal is to learn as you go, capture those learnings, and make adjustments. Remember that you are testing. And lastly, the ongoing learnings you are getting from your metrics and your adjustments are what will lead you to number 7, which is building a sustainable model that will be needed for long-term scaling and spreading. Okay, next slide. So the first project we're going to take you through is an example of how to get started when there is political will on a city leadership level to create change, but the infrastructure on the ground doesn't necessarily exist. To highlight, we're going to start by talking through a specific partnership GPL did with the city of Denver, Colorado. Next slide. Okay. So most of the time when we at the GPL are asked to talk about the Denver project, it's about what I would dub like the fancier elements of the project, which were really the financing and the evaluation. The financing being it was a social impact bond to finance permanent supportive housing, and the evaluation being that it was one of the longest run evaluations with a randomized control trial of 5 years to demonstrate systems impact. But what I want to talk about the Denver project is about really what was so simple about it. And that is Denver simply started with a problem that the people closest to the ground already knew about. Starting with the challenge, the Denver project actually came out of a public-facing effort around policing, with housing only emerging as a solution. The city commissioned a public safety task force to examine the problems and identify actionable recommendations. The task force included a wide range of stakeholders varying from police officers, homeless outreach teams, advocates, and direct service providers. They had a starting hypothesis and a recommendation that there was really a core group of offenders for really low-level quality of life crimes that were disproportionately cycling through the courts, and that this group was really primed for a substantive intervention to break that cycle. In terms of the GPL's role, we ran an embedded staff project to help run the project from design, implementation, and evaluation. Simpler terms, we were there to help define who are the people, what is the process, and influence the policy. For this conversation with you guys today, in keeping with the goal of breaking down how to get started, I want to dive into the first charge that we had, which was the task of helping to identify who the target population was that disproportionately represented a group in the courts for low-level offenses. As we thought about where to get started, we wanted the individuals that were touching the most systems most frequently, but that would mean getting data sharing agreements between hospitals, jails, detox programs, and shelters. I know from my experience running citywide efforts in New York City, sometimes getting those MOUs in place and working through how databases would speak to each other or identifying what would be the common identifiers that can be shared can literally take years to get done. In Denver at this time, there was no existing data sharing agreements to do any type of formal matches. And our team was initially only going to be there for 1 year for the initial engagement. And we really wanted to capitalize on the political will and the momentum that was in place at the time to really do something differently. So we really needed to get started immediately. We began with talking to the people that were really close to the problem. Through the process of speaking to members of the task force and their recommendations of whom else we should engage, it emerged that there was already an informal list of known people cycling through the courts the most. Specifically, the judges that would see these low-level cases had a list of people that they knew by name that kept going in front of them. Additionally, because it was criminal activity in court records, it was publicly available data. So there wasn't a delay in implementation of trying to figure out how to get the data sharing agreements in place in order for us to get started. Next slide. Starting from the original goal of thinking about public safety, we first defined the types of low-level offenders listed here at the bottom of the slide that really pointed towards needing a housing and a service support to disrupt the cycle through the court. Once we had the list, we were able to then additionally distill a group of high utilizers that were cycling through other systems, such as emergency rooms, detox, and ambulatory services, which were all extremely costly and largely ineffective over the long term. Next slide. From there, thinking about the stakeholders and the driving purpose of the pilot to find more solution-oriented government interventions for the target population that would be less punitive and less costly, the pilot articulated the cost savings of investing in permanent supportive housing over allowing the same group to continue to cycle through. With the investment into permanent supportive housing, we were able to design an effective, efficient, and client-centered referral process to get the target individuals connected to the proven intervention of permanent supportive housing that would both solve for their homelessness and also deliver the services that would be needed for the underlying behavioral health issues, which ultimately translated into positive outcomes across multiple systems. Next slide. So thinking about the quantitative impact of the pilot, the system outcomes to highlight include an upfront 40% reduction in those experiencing homelessness and long-term housing retention for this group, even at the 3-year mark. Additionally, there was a 30% reduction in jail stays. On the more qualitative outcomes from the Denver project, was that this really set the way in terms of future citywide efforts to convene around an issue with multiple agencies involved. It really made the way in terms of being able to establish necessary data sharing agreements and ongoing evaluation as a framework to show both efficacy and to justify city investment. Next slide. So let's map this back to the tactics we want to highlight. Denver had a clear North Star of defining a core group of individuals that they wanted to target. In this case, it was defining a population that really needed a service intervention instead of a criminal justice intervention, both for their individual wellness, but also to make an impact on the general public safety concerns and to make the case for a PSH investment. Second, we engaged people close to the problem, which in this case was the individuals working on the task force, who also work directly with the target clients in the shelters, in the jails, or in hospitals to shape the early problem statement and to establish a starting place. This helped establish the rapport with the people working in closest proximity to the individuals we wanted to reach, and it provided valuable insight that led to the initial path forward. Lastly, going to the far right side, the early work really created the momentum that helped accelerate the cumbersome work of getting data share agreements and partnerships in place. The initial starting place really paved the way to build out more formal agreements and the model for partnerships that were needed for scaling and spreading future cross-agency work for the city. Kate, anything you want to add, just sort of not necessarily on the Denver project, but just more broadly, just from your experience about getting started with projects?
Yeah, thanks, Carin. I think the thing that this example always makes me think about is the fact that the population that you were working with was multi-system involved, sort of necessarily means that there's a lot of interlocking complex problems that I'm sure the folks trying to make progress on some of these metrics were struggling to sort of peel apart. And I know that when we tell the story now, it sounds like really tidy of like, obviously housing was the place to start and we had all these great impacts, but just sort of naming again, the point you made about how important it is to start somewhere. I think just putting a stake in the ground and saying like, this is the system we want to start with, this really great pilot unfolded, but I'm sure that, in a different version of the world or a different timeline, you could have spent years just sort of cycling around trying to figure out like, which system do we want to start with or do we want to dig in with? And so in my experience on other pilots, there's not one right answer. They are all great places to start. And so I love the way that this story unfolded.
Yeah, I think that's really right. Okay, let's move on. Do you want to go to the next slide, Kate? That's great. So the next project we're going to highlight is an example of using real-time data to monitor if your pilot and your local investment is having the impact that you want it to have. All right, next slide. Okay, so here's the background. In the middle of the pandemic, like many jurisdictions, Chicago received federal funding for emergency relief. Chicago realized they needed to not only get the money out the door quickly and into the hands of those that desperately needed it, but they also knew at the same time that they needed to get it to the right hands, meaning those that needed it the most. The challenge was getting money out the door to those in need, but they knew that the need wasn't evenly distributed across all populations. From our experience, we know that the people most able to access rental assistance are often not the people that need it the most. Often rental assistance programs will accidentally cream for recipients because the people that have the time or the support to fill out applications, that easily access the language, or have sort of the documents ready to go, they're not necessarily the people that are most in need. Like with the pandemic itself, we knew that people without equal access to dominant systems or with language barriers would have a harder time accessing the rental assistance program without a very deliberate effort to reach them on our part. The GPL was brought on board to help identify priority populations, distribute the funds, and help ensure the investment had its intended impact. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's break down specifically what was put into place throughout the program that allowed for tight real-time monitoring of the intended impact of the project and facilitated real-time adjustments for continuous improvement. First, Chicago worked to identify and define priority populations based on their goal of helping communities of color disproportionately impacted by COVID. Because this was a clear North Star of their project, to get cash to those that urgently needed it the most, part of our task was to make sure we were collecting information about who was submitting applications so we could monitor in real time, recognizing the very real consequences receiving or not receiving this money would have for the most vulnerable of people. By collecting real-time data to monitor reach, we were able to catch and adjust when we saw that they were not hitting their intended mark. In the early phases of the project, there were lower levels of Latine populations that were applying, and so we had to adjust and tailor the outreach strategies and the application process to be more in alignment with our target population. The last point is what we really want to highlight in the tactics in terms of using high frequency metrics to improve and the need to be iterative. Because Chicago was gathering and assessing data on the applications they were receiving, they were able to see when they were not reaching target racial groups, and they made adjustments in their approach to course correct. If they had waited until the end to assess the impacts of the project, it would have been too late. It would have been that they spent X millions of dollars and it didn't go in fact to the people that needed it the most. Lastly, because they set up the process of pulling demographic data and they were able to compare across other data they had access to, such as unemployment data or COVID, they were able to have a continuous refinement, not only of their project, but also of what their priority populations needed to be in real time. All right, next slide. Okay. So you can see here, this was a really tight turnaround period that they were trying to assess what was happening in real time with the applications as they were coming in, and then trying to quickly make adjustments in their strategy. Based on where they saw gaps in need against who was applying and being approved for the rental assistance, they were able to make fixes to their outreach strategy and their eligibility process. The fixes that they put into place were relatively simple, but perhaps they wouldn't have been made if there wasn't data collection to show that there was a problem in the first place. Based on what they were seeing, the changes that they made included, they highlighted eligibility for non-citizens, they streamlined the application process, and they identified trusted messengers to help spread awareness of the program. The overall impact of the adjustment was a shift towards greater representation of Latine households and a higher approval rating, approval for Black households. Slide 20, can you go to the next one, please, Kate? Okay, so mapping this back to specific tactics that were used. First, Chicago had a very clear definition of the priority of the pilot, which translated to priority populations and the data they had to collect. Second, the use of the high frequency metrics led Chicago being able to tell in real time whether their project was having the intended impact. And when it wasn't, they were able to adjust and monitor for continuous improvement. Third, they adapted their approach as they were learning with different phases of release, adjusting the second release of applications with adjustments that they made based off the learnings from the first set of applications that came in. Kate, anything you want to add here just about continuous improvement, either for Chicago projects that were done with children and families or just more broadly from other project work?
Yeah, thanks, Carin. I thought one of the really interesting comments you made when you were just telling that story was about how those who are going to be sort of at the front of the line to access these resources may not be the ones who actually sort of represent the highest need or best align with the target population. And I think that's something that we see a lot throughout all of our different pilots, and especially in the social services programs, that the open front door is great, but it can mean that the folks who are navigating to resources tend to be higher resource individuals to begin with. And for the folks who may be a higher priority for actually accessing those resources or who have a higher need, tend to need sort of more outreach and engagement and support to actually get there. So I love that as an example of why it's so important to be really using those high frequency metrics to be understanding who is coming in that front door, who's accessing the resources, and then adapting your approach as you go. I think that's really key to having the intended impact of a pilot.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, Kate, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now to sort of talk about work that you did in Washington State.
Great, thanks. And I promised Carin when I was offering to be the one to project that I wouldn't try and guess when she wanted the slide transition. I'd wait for her to tell me because I always get anxious and push the button too early. So I just had to say that because I was really good, Carin. I didn't jump the gun at all.
You're great. You're great, Kate.
Thank you. Classic, overachiever. I need to be given that the affirmation as I go. So thank you for that. Okay, so for Washington here, we're going to talk about a project to connect families that are involved in the child welfare system that were experiencing child protection investigations. connecting them to more early learning services. And I know I just changed the slide and there's a bunch of really interesting stuff to read there, but before I start talking about what's on the slide, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background, and so you can just take a breath before you try and absorb what's there. We'll get to that. So our work with DCYF, which is the Department of Children, Youth, and Families in Washington State, started when the agency was first created about 5 years ago. And the idea behind DCYF was really in line with this broader movement in the children and family space, or in child welfare, to focus more on prevention. So by that, I mean, rather than waiting for something bad to happen to a family when they reach a point of crisis to get involved and offer supports, Washington State, like so many other jurisdictions, was trying to be more proactive about supporting families that may be struggling. And so the way Washington was doing that in this particular instance was to bring together these what had been two separate agencies: the Department of Early Learning, that was in charge of things like licensing kindergartens and childcare facilities and offering early intervention services, and the department that was previously in charge of child protection services, things like CPS investigations, foster care. So by bringing these two agencies together, that was really in line with a lot of research out there that suggests that early learning programs, the types of programs that the Department of Early Learning had, can help families prevent child maltreatment and reduce entries into foster care, and improve overall child well-being. And that's a lot of really good things. We want to keep families together. It's really traumatic when you remove a child from the home. So Washington's goal was to improve all of these outcomes by making the early learning services more available to the families that had been involved in the child welfare system, or were involved, and sort of de-silo those two agencies. And then just to make this really clear for you, when I say early learning services or family supports, what I mean by that are things like developmental preschool programs. I mentioned early intervention, which is if a child is diagnosed with a developmental delay, it can offer additional sort of specialized supports for that child to help them be ready for kindergarten, which is a really important sort of starting line for a lot of kids, to make sure that they sort of continue developing and achieving academic success, which, then has impacts for overall outcomes throughout your lifetime. So you can imagine if you are a new parent who is struggling to understand how to care for your infant, or if you couldn't find affordable childcare, that would be very stressful, and that getting connected to someone who can help you find subsidized childcare, or a nurse who could visit you and help explain what's going on with your baby, why they're crying, help coach you on how to manage that. That can really be the difference for a family between stabilizing and reaching a point of like critical stress that can then result in a crisis. So that's why these services were so important for these families. And that's where the storyline of GPL first picks up. So the challenge that we found was that while these two agencies have been brought together in name, like so many mergers or structural changes within government, email addresses, websites had changed, but like in practice, you still had the same set of folks sort of doing the work in the same way that they had always done. And so our project was really focused on helping DCYF operationalize this new mandate that they had to increase the number of families that were going to get connected to these early learning services. And what we found through our early diagnostic efforts is that only about half of the families that were eligible for these services, which was any family with a child under the age of 5, were actually getting connected or offered these services at all. So just walking you through in a little bit more detail, and I'm speaking now to the bottom of the slide, some of the things that we found in our diagnostic effort with DCYF was that because caseworkers these services were new to them, there was nothing in their system or sort of case protocol to remind them to ask families about whether or not they had early learning needs or if they were interested in these services. And so if you're at all familiar with casework for child protection services, there's roughly 5,000 things you need to remember at any given moment. And so like adding this as the 5,001st thing meant that it was often slipping their minds. And so as a result, families were having to sort of, the ones who are getting connected were the ones who were raising their hands and saying, I'd be interested in something like this. Can you help me? Not necessarily the ones, as we were speaking about in the debriefing example from Chicago, not necessarily the ones who most needed that service. Workers were also less familiar with these services, and so had a harder time explaining what they were, which you can imagine would really impact the family's perception of the service or their ability to understand like what would be helpful about it. And if you were unsure about, you can imagine if you were unsure about whether or not you wanted to access a service and the person explaining it to you isn't doing a very compelling job, that's not really going to be helpful in convincing you. And then lastly, sort of looking to the enroll and follow-up pieces. Every community organization that was offering these services, this is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but almost everyone had a different process for how they handle these referrals, including some were still using fax machines, et cetera, et cetera. So in addition to having to know all of the different people at the different organizations to complete the referral, there was a different process for all of the different referrals, which in the end meant that families, the caseworkers weren't sort of able to track and know all the different ways that families could get connected to services, and meant that in the end, families were really having to do that navigation for themselves. And I always say, I can like barely make it to a doctor's appointment. It takes me like roughly 6 to 8 weeks to get anything done in my personal life. So I can't even imagine for families that were struggling with much more stressful circumstances to be able to do that. Thanks, Kate, for leaving your camera on and for laughing at my jokes.
I'm always here for that. I completely feel you on that timeline. So go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So and just to set this in context too, I'm going to talk about what we did and what the challenges were so that you can understand, like when I talk about the scaling and spreading, what exactly we were scaling and spreading. So switching over to solutions, once we completed this diagnostic effort with DCYF, the GPL helped DCYF test, design, and implement a lot of these solutions that I've got highlighted here, working very closely with frontline workers. And so that included things like the GPL fellow that we had on the ground spent days shadowing frontline workers, going on ride-alongs with them to see, what was their day like. That was the moment that she recognized, like, oh my gosh, adding this to the list of things that the caseworkers have to remember is just like unreasonable. There so many things going on. We did process mapping exercises with caseworkers to have them really step through what was supposed to be happening according to policy, what was actually happening in process or in practice. We did focus groups. In this instance, we didn't do focus groups with the clients themselves, but I always recommend that and getting sort of the client experience of the process. And we were working really, really iteratively. And so what we ended up doing, just to give you sort of a sample of the types of solutions that DCYF was testing, was number one, we helped them create what we called the eligibility report, which was basically just a new way of organizing the case information that caseworkers got so that they could have an easy list of everyone on their caseload who was age eligible for these programs. So everyone under the age of 5, which included not just the child who the allegation of abuse or neglect involved, but also their siblings. So like one dynamic of how families were often falling through the cracks is that you might have an older sibling, someone in high school was involved in the allegation about abuse or neglect, but they had a younger sibling that might have been eligible for these services. And that was getting missed very frequently by caseworkers. This tool is also really helpful for supervisors to be able to have a sort of a checklist with their staff to be able to walk through and say, oh, like I see, you have these 5 kids on your caseload this week that are age appropriate for these services. What have you done to offer these services? Second, we added a question to the workflow for workers so that as they were clicking through all of the little screens that they had to click through and asking families questions about their circumstances, they were prompted to ask about early learning services if this would be something that families would be interested in. And then thirdly, we created a conversation guide. And the reason why we did that and what that was, so the reason was that as we started collecting data about these referrals, we saw that one of the most common reasons that the referrals weren't successful is that parents were saying no to services. And while these were totally voluntary services, and we didn't want to have workers sort of stepping into the space of being coercive, we did want to make sure that caseworkers were armed with sort of responses to some of the most common concerns that parents might be raising and being able to answer their questions effectively. And so to create this, I forced some of the DCYF staff to do role-playing exercises, which no one is ever excited about, but was super rich for us in terms of being able to get tips and tactics from the workers who were really successful at completing these referrals and talking to parents, and sort of memorialize that in a guide that the workers could, that we then could spread out to other workers that they could use to follow. The conversation guide also included a service matching guide so that workers could do a quick skim and understand what were the services that they should be offering and how to explain them quickly. And I'll just say one of the funny things about this was that the original draft of this was created by a GPL fellow, was a very thoughtful, beautiful, and concise one-page guide that helped you match clients to services based on characteristics like their age, whether or not they had a developmental delay. And when we sent that to the caseworkers to use, they almost completely rejected it because what they wanted was something that looked much more like this very clunky and difficult to navigate table that they used for other programs. And so it was just sort of a funny moment of where we thought we had created a very thoughtful design. In fact, was not what the client, in this case, the caseworkers, really wanted. So these improvements, these sort of system level improvements, we were tracking referrals, as I mentioned, to sort of understand how we were doing using those high frequency metrics. We saw things getting better, but they weren't getting better quickly enough. And so it turned out that the most important change that we made was helping the agency create a position that was fully focused on identifying the eligible families and completing these referrals. And so that's now mapping out at the bottom of the slide here, this what we call the navigator role. And the reason why this was so important is that as we got into the problem of trying to make these connections, we realized that the caseworkers were always going to be more focused on the child's physical safety as a top priority, given the potential risk of missing something or not assessing a situation correctly. And these referrals that were focused more on well-being services were just always going to get crowded out by those more urgent priorities. But because these early learning referrals were so important and so core to the agency's new mandate, they agreed to test this new position. And their role, the navigator role, was really focused on working shoulder to shoulder with caseworkers. So one navigator might help and advise and engage families across 30 to 40 different caseworkers. So they were sort of one navigator per office, and they interacted with families in a lot of different ways, including, sometimes they were just sort of coming in at the end of a case to make sure that families were getting offered and connected to these services. And then other times they were serving as more of a broker. So it was the caseworker that was doing all the family facing engagement, and the navigator was just really sort of interfacing with the provider to make sure that there was going to be a space available once the referral was completed. And I think a very normal reaction that someone working in government might have when they hear this solution is, that's great, but that's never going to happen in my agency. Creating new roles is very expensive and it takes a lot of time. And I totally hear that. I think that's the reaction that I think a lot of the DCYF staff we had that we were working with had to this. So just to tell you a little bit about how we made this work, one of our government leaders that we were partnering with figured out how to use include this position as a pilot for 3 roles in a federal grant that they were completing. So it was 3 years, 3 roles. It was really truly a pilot effort. And really from the very beginning, we were getting a lot of the questions that I was mentioning before of, how are we going to get this to scale? Is this really sustainable? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but first I want to just tell you a little bit about some of the results that we got from the pilot, because I think that was really important in the story of scaling. So the sort of headline result was that we went from, by implementing this navigator position, we went from less than half the families getting these referrals when we were just testing those systems level solutions that I mentioned to, excuse me, 75% that were getting assessed or connected for these services with the navigator role implemented. And some things that I want to call out about this result in particular is that One, we generated this data using a fairly like an Excel file, basically, that the navigators were filling out to sort of track their work. And the baseline that we have on the left-hand side of the slide really is not perfect. It was some rough numbers that we were able to generate from having caseworkers fill out a similar referral tracker. But even if the data wasn't perfect, these results were really important in one, helping us drive learnings. And as I mentioned with the example of creating the conversation guide based on the referral data and sort of identifying why referrals were falling off. This also really helped us build the case and build momentum within DCYF that this new position was really working. And so I guess the takeaway that I really want you to have from this graph is that data can be rough and only directionally correct and still be helpful. And I'll just tell one more quick story about this because I think it's really poignant. Is so on the far right hand side of the slide, it says of cases where navigators made or attempted a referral, we estimate that 45% of families started services. And so this is one of the questions that senior executives within DCYF were most concerned about as we thought about trying to scale the position, is like, okay, great, you're offering all these referrals, you're assessing all these families, but how many of them are actually getting connected to services? And to get this number, I was like bothering every day the three navigators who were responsible for generating these referrals to call families and follow up, call providers, figure out who's referring or who's actually enrolling. And it was just really like a 3-month effort where I was pushing them to get some of this data. This is not by any means a statistically significant data point, but it's enough to know that it wasn't 4% of families that connected. It was, 45, might have been 40, might have been 50, but it's still, a ballpark that was really meaningful for DCYF staff in terms of convincing them to move forward with this pilot. Okay, and so then just to wrap up here, thinking about planning for scale and sustainability, pulling this all together. So with these results, we really took a 2-pronged approach to trying to get this position, to supporting DCYF to get this position scaled. So first, we helped them think about what they could do with the navigator role. And I'm speaking here to the left-hand side of the slide. We tried to think about this really flexibly, help the government staff think about different versions of the role that they could create, and gave them different price tags. So, do you want to mix up the client population that they're focused on by broadening it or narrowing it, which would make the position more or less expensive? Because you had to have more or fewer navigators depending on how many clients they were trying to serve. We also helped them do some thinking about how to use the runway. So that's what I call the additional 2 years of the grant. So we started this thinking in year 1 of the grant and had this first conversation about scaling at the end of year 1. So we had 2 additional years of funding to think about like how to make this transition. And we gave them some options to think about how best to use that. So we didn't wait until the funding was running out. And then the second prong of the approach was on the right-hand side, was more or less a contingency plan. We tried to think about how to take the best parts of the navigator role, what was really working, and build that to more of these systems level solutions that could be implemented without having a dedicated staff position. So that's things like the conversation guide. And we actually even had the navigators be the ones training caseworkers on how to use the conversation guide and how to make these referrals. We also embedded some of the metrics that we were able to generate with some of the changes we've made to the case management system, so that was included in existing decision-making structures and dashboards that leadership was looking at regularly, so that they would continue to sort of come back to this data. And how does the story end? It's still ongoing. Most importantly, speaking to the map on the bottom left-hand side of the slide, DCYF has continued to build on this pilot even after GPL support has ended. So they've doubled the number of positions and counties that they're working in, even just through additional grant funding that they've gotten. And they're continuing to advocate for state funding to be able to fund this position at scale on an ongoing basis. And the reason why I think that has continued even after our support has ended is you have some of the loudest voices for advocating for this coming from frontline and field staff who are saying this is what is really making a difference for families. And I think we got there by making sure that we were getting their buy-in and their input on shaping the solution. So that meant that we ended up creating something that actually worked. And they were also invested in the outcome. So they were continuing to tell their leadership that this is what mattered. So just to round this out, I think I could make a case that basically all of these tactics were used in the Washington case, but to highlight a couple of the most important ones, when thinking about engaging those closest to the problem I just mentioned, getting buy-in and engagement from field and frontline staff was really critical to this pilot continuing to have a life after GPL support ended. And then planning scale from the beginning, just summarizing a couple of the tactics that I already talked about. We were capturing the data to build a case, even if it was rough data. In the first year of the grant, we were thinking about what would we need to scale rather than waiting until time and money was running out to start having those conversations. We had a contingency plan and presented a range of options for state decision makers to think about. And most importantly, DCYF didn't let any of these hurdles or complications deter them from continuing to make the case for this big bet and trying a new role at state level. Carin, anything that you would pick out from that case?
No, I mean, I think just two things that you sort of said at the beginning that just really resonated with me. The first is just sort of, that so often there is just like there's a large, decision or announcement about sort of changes that are happening, but then there isn't like a lot of like connective tissue about how those changes actually are expected to then sort of like trickle down into everyday sort of operations. And I think it's just so hard, especially if you're talking about human service agencies in particular, if they're dealing with like often sort of really emergency response or sort of really critical response or vulnerable populations, like it's so hard to expect that 5001 thing to be sort of picked up too, especially if there's not like a clear roadmap of like what the expectation is to how you're actually supposed to get there and deliver on these like wide sweeping changes that have been announced or put into place. The second is just this question also of, how do you not just present it as being an additional thing that is done, but more of a reframing of sort of the roles and figuring out how does this one additional piece actually take other things sort of off the board in terms of streamlining people's jobs and sort of the expectations so that it's not just more and more and more as much as it is trying to reframe or finding different ways to get at the core of what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that really resonates for me. And I finally had a chance to look more closely at the chat, and I'll just say the comment that Nancy made about the navigators probably had success because the person was not seen as so closely associated with CPS staff 100%. That was a big part of why that role I think worked really well. And then Allison asked a question if any of the forms that we changed were incorporated into the case management system. And yes, it took a really long time. That was one of the hardest things, was to get IT to change the case management system. But that was definitely part of it. So, okay. I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we can transition to just open Q&A time. Unless there's anything else. Yeah,
I know Allison had asked you a specific question in the chat here, and I think also Allison was raising their hand.
Oh my gosh, I can't even see hand raises. I think I